So you've been in your role for a little over a year now. What's the past year been like for you?
I'd say, Daryl, it's been really interesting. This last year, I think Canadians and Indigenous people have seen one of the most challenging but also most difficult times in a very short period of time. This last year, I think, is like a microcosm of how many people are feeling, how they're dealing with things. From the beginning of my term, of course, we were still dealing with the drastic and long-lasting effects of COVID and COVID-19 in our Indigenous communities, in urban centers, and particularly in hospitals. And then we went right into a really global emergency. You know, we've seen the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so we had to recalibrate, reposition how we thought about things. Then, of course, what would follow is something that we're all in together right now, which is the cost of living crisis. It's no secret that people have done better than others throughout this crisis. And the people who are doing really good right now are folks that I hope spend the remainder of my time in this place holding accountable and making sure some of that money gets back in the pockets of Indigenous communities and Canadians.
Now, is there anything that maybe surprised you when you entered politics, where you were like, "Wow, you know, I didn't know this," or "This isn't how I thought it would go," or something like that?
Interestingly, I guess my expectations of the place were already kind of, they weren't that high, to be really honest. You know, I've known from working in proximity of this place, you know, before I got involved in the big house in this way, I was working with the Métis settlements of Alberta, and I was their national director for 5 years. And so I had worked with this government, I had negotiated with this government on behalf of Indigenous communities. I had known many of the things, I guess, from that experience going into my role as an MP, how decisions were made, who was making decisions, and worse yet, how sometimes the most disappointing part, I think, in my experience, has been when the commitments of the government don't actually translate into real dynamic solutions for Indigenous communities. And it's a choice of the government to do that.
And how frustrating is it for you when something like that happens? Is it like, you know, you want this to happen, and is it kind of like, you know, why can't we just push this through or get this done?
Okay, one of them is really interesting. I'll give you just an example of one file that I've had immense frustration with. And it's the file that I think means a lot to most Indigenous people, and my family included, which is the crisis that's facing Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit folks, which is the fact that they're continuing to go missing and they're being murdered at rates disproportionate to the general public, and rates that are extreme and extraordinary, amounting to what the report calls genocide. You know, this is an emergency facing community members. Girls and women, Two-Spirit folk can't even go out, especially in Winnipeg, for example, out on the regular streets to be able to experience what this place is about without oftentimes being met with harassment and at worst times, ultimately violence. And so the government did commit way back in as early as 2019 in the budget. They said, we're going to spend $2 billion on this crisis. You know, we were pumped. I was happy about this. We need resources in the hands of people who know how to handle this emergency. We need that money in the hands of Indigenous people. But what we've noticed is actually the fact that although the government has committed this funding, they've barely spent any. And in some cases, less than 10% of the overall global budget. And so it goes to show, after 7 years, their priorities, and if they have allocated the money, not spent it, you know, that's a serious concern that's misleading to Indigenous people.
Mm-hmm. And I guess I wanted to ask, you know, how does your Cree and Métis heritage sort of affect how you do your job? You know, is it something that's always in the back of your mind, especially for something like you had just talked about, trying to get things like that pushed through?
Oh, definitely. I think the way that we're raised, the way I was raised, at least, by elders, community members in the Fishing Lake Métis settlement where I'd grown up, there was always a message about the community, the village raising children. You might remember that from your own community. There was a campaign in the early 90s, late 80s, where many Indigenous communities tried to reclaim culture, and there was a movement across the prairies to look at how children are, in fact, the beginning of something really important. And I've taken that as a lesson, especially right now, when we're just not discovering, when we're reclaiming and locating Indigenous children and their bodies across Turtle Island in establishments known as residential schools, although far from it. These messages of the value of our children, compounded by the stark and dangerous and sad reality of Canada's residential schools, is something that I have to, and many politicians who are also Indigenous, like my colleague Laurie Idlau, we have to deal with that. Going into that place every day, knowing that we're almost in the belly of the beast. It's an institution similar to residential schools in that it demands conformity and wants you to release those things before entering. But, there have been many other people who've been through that place, like Louis Riel, for example, who had stark convictions, who said, I will be elected to this house and I will not forgo who I am. And that is the message I think Indigenous parliamentarians take every single day, no matter what party they come from. Often they come into that place with pride for their people, and I think we have that instilled in us from a young age, and it's something that we view the entire world through that lens of understanding that we have a role in this place, and we have behind us generations of ancestors who fought for the basic dignity and respect that many Indigenous communities are still fighting for today.
And Blake, I just want to go sort of back before you got into politics. Did you grow up wanting to be a politician, and being young and Indigenous, did you grow up wanting to get into this and say, hey, maybe this is how I can make a change or make changes?
Not particularly. It wasn't necessarily how I started out. Growing up in the community, we have to imagine what that looks like for some of your viewers. Some of your viewers might not have ever heard of a Métis settlement, for example. Many Indigenous people in Alberta know what they are because they're these largely big communities in terms of landmass relative to other Indigenous communities in northern Alberta. They were established in the 1930s. They were families that got together, destitute families from across the region, Métis families that gathered and tried to support one another in these Métis settlements. So I'm a descendant of this history and understanding that we needed to find ways to survive. And so I think when I think about or contemplate how I was raised and how we could project into the future ways that it's impacted me, it's going to impact others, it's about rooting oneself in who we are that I think really helps to impact the decisions we make. And so, yeah, I'd say I missed the last part of your question, I realized, but I'd say that's part of the lens we need.
And just the last part was just sort of, how you got into it and maybe why you got into politics, really.
Oh, why? Interesting. Okay, well, I'd say it was kind of like tumbling downstairs. You're not really certain where the next step will hit you. And so I started off in my community just trying to help people. I was working for Public Works in Fishing Lake, and that's where I really got introduced, I think, to seeing the deplorable conditions of my relatives, of other family members, and really basic things like this struggle to try to just get clean water into some of these homes, the struggle of trying to just repair a door or a window and not having the resources in the community to do that. Shocking. And so that tumbled into my work in advocacy at university, where I would move to Edmonton, where I represent a constituency there now, where I learned many of the histories and issues related to the impact of residential school, 60 scoop, and government policies that eventually contributed to what I experienced in the settlement. And so then translating that to my work as the national director, I would want to confront these systems and understand that change needs to be made. And then the opportunity arose to become an MP. This was something I wasn't expecting in any way. I just kept working and working and working, and then found that people were taking notice and seeing that, I was effective in many ways in trying to get some of the things that I was able to achieve during my period as national director. And then when we were able to achieve them, it was an opportunity for me to take that to the next step and see that Canada as a whole has to understand that reconciliation is a part of and a mandate of citizenship, and that there are things Canadians have to do and things I have to do to inform Canadians about that responsibility.
And Blake, we had sort of touched on it briefly a little earlier. You talked about, there's many Indigenous voices in Parliament, and regardless of the party, just how important is it that they're bringing these Indigenous voices into governments, and why is it so important?
Oh, that's a really good question, and I hope that many young viewers in particular who are watching really take special note of how important it truly is to have representation in these places. They're not a silver bullet, that's for sure. We know that more than anyone else, that these institutions that are largely foreign to our own Indigenous governance structures are largely foreign. But that doesn't mean we should preclude the opportunity to advance our people and the rights and well-being of other persons in this country, something we've always done in this land and something that we should continue to do, and this is another way we can do it. And so that's best case scenario. Worst case scenario, it's harm reduction. We're in a place where we can call out and stop and even save lives of Indigenous people when they don't have the opportunity to be a part of those decisions. Canada has historically made decisions on behalf of Indigenous people, right down to the fact that we still have the very powerful Indian Act, which is still administered by the Minister of Indigenous and Crown Relations and the Minister of Indigenous Services Canada. These institutions still exist, meaning that Indigenous people, when precluded from those institutions, need to find space to make and be part of decisions. Parliament is a place that Indigenous people often have been neglected from, but that's changing. There's many of us now in Parliament from all parties, and any party that attempts to or restrict or even prohibit Indigenous voices is one that shouldn't belong in Canada, because most Canadians believe Indigenous people have a place here and deserve a voice here.
And Blake, what are some barriers, I guess, that Indigenous politicians might face that non-Indigenous politicians don't?
Okay, language, huge. Language is one of the biggest ones. Canada recognizes 2 official languages. It's completely neglectful of the fact that we have so many incredible, diverse, and important languages here in Turtle Island that manifest who we are as people, our mission here, and why we remain, and why that culture is so important. When we neglect at the most pinnacle institution in the country that makes decisions on behalf of people, and when the government makes a commitment that says no relationship is more important to the government of Canada than that with Indigenous peoples, we have to assume that these institutions would change and become safer places. But what we've seen is the status quo. I've seen, for example, Indigenous members of Parliament, including my own colleague, Laurie Idlout, really work hard to try to find ways to include her native language, Inuktitut, in the official speeches and translation services at the House of Commons. I've had difficulties trying to smudge in this place. My own ceremony, my own swearing-in ceremony, for example, it was a whole ordeal. I think we had 14 fire marshals present at my ceremony that were required to be there. And these are the kinds of things that are not figured out yet. And these are things that we're still bushwhacking at. We know that there will be more Indigenous people to follow us. And we have to take the opportunity while we're sitting in this place to make sure we carve that path and we make a really nice path. We bushwhack that path so that the next generation, when they come through, can speak their language proudly, have the translation services ready, and even see our own laws, our own language written in the laws of Canada.
And Blake, we'll end it on this question here, kind of on the flip side of the one I just asked. What can you and other Indigenous politicians bring to the table that non-Indigenous politicians can't?
Oh, there's so much. There's a great diversity of Indigenous nations within North America. And the more Indigenous people are elected, the more we understand the deep connection Indigenous people have to this place. And we all, no matter where we're from coast to coast to coast, can learn from that. We can learn about the importance of where we are, what is truly part of this place, and we can seek to achieve unity and protection for it. I think that is the message that Indigenous people bring oftentimes to this place, to Parliament, and it's something that I think it will continue to happen. More so, I think they provide a unique lens that, like I was mentioning earlier, stops in some ways some of the harm that could be done, but also increases the opportunity to see change, to see corrections, and to see opportunity for Indigenous nations that could otherwise be left out. Because to be frank, the people who are elected to Parliament, they come from very different communities than most Indigenous folks. They don't know in many ways the reality. And so they need folks to tell them. They need peers. Some folks still in Canada have never even spoken to an Indigenous person in their life. And you can imagine what a place like Parliament would be like if it's filled with people like this. And so our presence there is important. It shows visibility and demonstrates that we're still here.
That's certainly well said, Blake. We're going to have to leave it right there. I think that's a great way to end it. But I want to thank you for taking some time out of your day to speak with us, share some of your knowledge and your insights. And again, we really appreciate you taking some time. Thank you, Miigwech.
Awesome. Thanks, Darryl.